What is up, everybody? Welcome to the 8th episode of the Playing Games podcast, and today we're going to go over, can stretching make you more flexible? Now, this has been a topic that has been on and off on many people, and especially in the fitness industry, talking about, is stretching or is stretching beneficial? Does it even do anything structurally? Is it just a neurological standpoint? So we're going to go over all that today and the contents that I'm going to provide you. So what is stretching? Muscle length and fascicle length, stretching and muscle length, neural and non-neural mechanisms, what happens when you stretch, and everything's going to be summarized in the conclusion. So first things first, I think it's important to lay the groundwork. What is stretching? When you think of stretching, try picturing you go to try to touch your toes, and you reach a little bit below halfway, but as soon as you get close to your toes, maybe like an inch away or 2 inches away, you start to feel your hamstrings get a little tight. Have you ever thought to yourself, it's like, well, my hamstrings just aren't long enough to allow me to reach that end range of motion? Well, that's actually not the case. In fact, if you were to rip your hamstrings outside of your body and just like stretch it out or stretch that muscle out, you'd be surprised about the muscle extensibility, because sometimes it could even exceed a certain joint's range of motion. That's probably why if you see people who are under, anesthesia, I think it is, where it just knocks them out because it turns off like their central nervous system, which we're going to get into a little bit. If you just get someone who's like knocked out, you're going to see them be able to do splits, or doctors are able to move their limbs a lot easier than when they're awake, because it's not just a muscle structural standpoint. It's not allowing you to reach that certain position. In fact, most stretching movements don't reach a muscle's maximum length unless you break some bones along the way. If you were to actually increase the hamstring's whole muscle length, you'd end up it'd end up being more loose, and it could just, lose its efficiency to contract properly. So the real limiting factor is actually the central nervous system, or the CNS, that doesn't allow you to reach certain positions because it registers these positions as potentially dangerous muscle lengths. So essentially, when you go to try to touch your toes and you feel your hamstring get tight, it's not that your hamstrings aren't long enough to allow you to do that. It's rather the central nervous system or the brain sending a signal to your hamstring saying, hey, we don't want to go there because we don't own that range of motion of the movement, or we just are scared to go there because it can be potentially harmful, right? But that is why when you see someone who's knocked out, or when doctors knock people out using anesthesia, their central nervous system just shuts off, which is why they are able to kind of like move the limbs so much easier now without any like stiffness holding them back. Pretty cool. So, muscle length and muscle fascicle length. Those two have always been used interchangeably when we talk about stretching. But if we're going to use the correct terminology when we're talking about stretching, it's actually muscle fascicle length, not muscle length, right? They don't equal to each other. And muscle fascicles are just muscle fibers bounded together, surrounded by a layer of paramecium. In fact, muscle fascicles can run from one end of the muscle to another. Muscle fibers, on the other hand, don't always span across the entire length of the muscle. There are things like non-spanning muscle fibers, which don't run the entire length of the muscle. But regardless, there seems to be a clear limit on how much muscle fascicles can increase in length while preserving their contractile functionality. But it has been shown that growth up to 34% has occurred, which to me I thought was pretty cool, pretty impressive. Because, remember, if you were to lengthen the entire muscle, maybe too much, it would end up getting too loose and lose its efficiency to contract. But the longer the muscle fascicles are, the greater their extensibility can be, and the longer range of motion they can have. So, stretching and muscle length. While high-intensity stretching has been shown to increase muscle fascicle length, most stretching modalities do not affect a muscle's architecture. Most of the long-term improvements in flexibility from conventional stretching are more neural than structural. This is because the greater your neural stretch tolerance increases, the more range of motion the muscle tendon properties would have. So, when we talk about neural and non-neural mechanisms, there's a couple. And there are several neural mechanisms like increases in pain threshold and decrease in agonist reflex activation that can contribute to an increase in extensibility. Nerves themselves can also become less stiff. There's also temporary increases in viscoelasticity that can lead to greater increases in tissue flexibility. Now, this is a non-neural mechanism. And viscoelasticity, I believe, is a term in material science and continuum mechanics. When we talk about something being elastic or having more elasticity, it can stretch more given the force that's being provided, right? Or think of a rubber band. The more you stretch a rubber band, the more resistance it's going to provide. So when you let go of it and you stop applying force, it's just going to shoot back into its resting length, right? But muscles aren't just elastic. They're actually viscoelastic, which makes it more complex. But to put it in simple terms, the more you keep a muscle in a stretch position, it's going to gradually reduce the resistance it's going to provide to shoot back to its resting length. Right? Decreases in passive and stiffness can also contribute, but it's not always seen even after weeks of stretching. So, after all this, we can summarize everything and talk about what happens when you stretch, because there's a couple of things that can occur. First things first, viscoelasticity can increase after hard stretching, usually over 2 minutes, but it is temporary. Don't think of it as a permanent thing. Neural stretch tolerance also increases, though it can be lost over time if you stop stretching for whatever reason. It can be reinforced by repetition. So if you do lose, your stretch tolerance because you stop stretching, you can always regain it back through stretching again, being consistent with stretching, right? Consistency is very important, whether it comes to muscle building or, any goal you have in life. Now, in the long run, muscle tendon stiffness could decrease, which would reduce passive resistance to being lengthened, which I think is pretty interesting. Muscles and tendon length would remain equal in length after conventional stretching routines because, the regular stretching modalities won't actually change muscle architecture, usually. And then lastly, the nervous system will change its signal to a relaxed muscle in that position. So if you go back to touch your toes and you've been doing it for some period of time, the brain is no longer going to send such a strong signal to the hamstring saying, hey, don't go there. It's a bad area or it's a dangerous area. It's going to be like, well, we've been doing this for a while. It's not new. We've been exposed to it for some period of time. So the signal will be more relaxed, and eventually you would find that you are able to touch your toes because you now own that part of the range of motion, and it's no longer a dangerous area or a new area that you expose your body to. And that is pretty much it. I hope that summarized everything in a simple manner for you to understand and have some take-home applications to it, or just even have a better understanding of what happens when you stretch. And you can go talk to your friends or you could go talk to your friends about the certain mechanisms if they care. But as always, make sure to subscribe. You can always follow us on Insta if you have any questions. Coach Juan, and for Jack, he's not here, but his Instagram tag is Deltoid Factory. And you could always, as always, you could always ask questions in the comments too below, and I'll do my best to answer them to the best of my abilities. So thank you, and see you next time.